At the reading of my billionaire father's will, he left everyone millions of dollars. I only got $90. My mother smiled. My brother laughed. I said nothing, staring at the money he left me. He had quietly marked something on it. At the bank, the manager looked at me and froze. My name is Charmaine, 35 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful software developer, I escaped their toxicity, but maintained occasional contact. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. Growing up in the elite circles of Atlanta meant privilege to outsiders. But inside our sprawling home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. Our house, with its manicured lawn and heated swimming pool, was a fortress of expectations I could never quite meet. My childhood bedroom became my sanctuary and a prison. From elementary school through high school, I maintained straight A's and joined honor societies, but it was never enough for them. My mother, Valerie, preferred the socialite lifestyle and constantly compared me to my older brother, Trey, the undisputed golden child of the Sterling family. I was expected to sit quietly in the background and applaud his mediocrity while my own achievements were brushed under the rug. The tension finally reached its ultimate breaking point on a sweltering Tuesday afternoon, inside the stuffy mahogany-paneled office of my father's estate lawyer. The air conditioner was broken, making the heavy room feel completely suffocating. Attorney Davis cleared his throat, adjusting his gold-rimmed glasses, as he looked down at the thick stack of parchment paper on his massive oak desk. My mother sat perfectly straight in a high-backed leather chair. She was dressed in an impeccable black morning suit, though her eyes held absolutely zero grief. Next to her sat Trey, tapping his expensive Italian leather shoes impatiently against the floorboards. His wife, Sasha, an African-American former reality television star who married into our family strictly for the prestige, was busy scrolling on her phone. Her massive diamond tennis bracelet caught the light every time she moved her wrist. Attorney Davis flipped to the final page of the legal document. He took a slow, deep breath, avoiding my gaze entirely. And to my daughter Charmaine, he read aloud, his voice tight with discomfort, "I leave $90 in cash." The silence that followed lasted only a fraction of a second before Trey burst into loud, echoing laughter. He leaned back in his chair, clapping his hands together like he had just watched a brilliant comedy routine. Sasha immediately looked up from her phone, a vicious smirk spreading across her perfectly contoured face. "Well, Charmaine," Sasha sneered, her voice dripping with pure venom. $90 should just about cover the internet bill for that pathetic little basement application you call a business. Maybe you can buy yourself a nice cup of cheap coffee to cry into while you type your little codes. I kept my face completely blank, refusing to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. I looked across the desk at Attorney Davis, waiting for the punchline. But the elderly lawyer simply reached into his desk drawer, pulled out a crisp white envelope, and slid it across the polished wood toward me. Inside were exactly 9 crisp $10 bills. My mother finally spoke. Her voice was cold and sharp as cracked glass. "Your father gave you a choice, Charmaine. He practically begged you to give up that silly little tech startup of yours. He offered you a prominent position as your brother's executive assistant. You could have had a generous salary. You could have been part of the Sterling family legacy. But you were too stubborn and far too arrogant. You chose to embarrass this family by peddling software like a common merchant instead of taking your rightful place behind Trey. You brought this humiliation entirely on yourself. Now sign the release forms and leave. We have real family business to discuss." She reached over and coldly pushed a stack of legal release forms across the table toward me. The message was crystal clear. By signing, I would acknowledge the receipt of my $90 inheritance and waive any future right to contest the will. They wanted me out of the picture permanently, legally barred from ever claiming a single cent of the empire my father built from the ground up. Trey leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his eyes gleaming with sheer arrogance. "You know what the funniest part is, little sister? I am officially the Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Logistics and Holdings now. And guess who owns the commercial high-rise where you currently lease your little startup office? I do. Since you only have $90 to your name. I am tripling your rent effective tomorrow morning, if you cannot pay it, and we both know you cannot. I will have building security throw your servers and your hipster employees out onto the street. Sasha let out a high-pitched giggle, adjusting her diamonds again. You should probably start packing today, Charmaine. Cardboard boxes are pretty cheap at the hardware store. They sat there, a unified front of greed and spite, completely secure in their victory. For my entire life, they had treated me like a disappointing stain on the Sterling family portrait. When I chose to study computer science and financial technology instead of attending the socialite finishing schools my mother preferred, I became the black sheep. When I refused to marry a wealthy heir they picked out for me, I became an outcast. And when I built my own financial technology company from scratch without asking them for a single dime, I became a massive threat to their fragile egos. But they always assumed they held all the power. They assumed my father agreed with their harsh assessment of my worth. I looked down at the white envelope resting on the table. Slowly, deliberately, I picked it up and pulled out the 9 $10 bills. The money felt strange in my hands. It made absolutely no sense. My father was a self-made billionaire. He was a brilliant, meticulous man who never did anything by accident or out of petty spite, even in his final days in the hospital. His mind was sharper than a steel trap. He had taught me everything I knew about encryption, about finding hidden value where others saw nothing but noise. I fanned the bills out across my lap. Under the harsh, bright fluorescent lights of the lawyer's office, I noticed something strange about the paper. On the bottom right corner of each bill, there was a faint, microscopic discoloration. It was ultraviolet ink. It formed a sequence of numbers and letters, a specific cipher. My heart hammered a steady, powerful rhythm against my ribs. It was the exact same encryption key my father had taught me how to decode when I was 15 years old. He used to hide little puzzles for me around his home office to test my coding skills. While Trey was out crashing luxury cars and buying his way out of trouble with family money, my father and I had spoken our own private language of numbers and logic. Suddenly, the entire room faded away. The mocking laughter of my brother, the sneers from my sister-in-law, the cold glare of my mother. None of it mattered. I knew exactly what I was holding. This was not an insult. This was a bearer token. I carefully slipped the 9 bills back into the envelope and placed it securely inside my designer purse. Then I reached for this heavy silver pen resting on Attorney Davis' desk. "Are you going to cry?" Charmaine Trey taunted, leaning back with a smug grin. "Do not get tears on the legal documents. It ruins the ink, and I want to frame your signature." I smiled. It was a slow, genuine smile that caused a brief flash of utter confusion to cross my mother's face. I signed my name at the bottom of the release form with a smooth, sweeping motion. I pushed the stack of papers back across the desk to the lawyer. "Keep the pen." "Attorney Davis," I said smoothly. I stood up from the heavy leather chair and smoothed the front of my tailored blazer. I looked directly at Trey, my gaze locking onto his arrogant eyes. "Enjoy the chief executive title, Trey. It comes with a lot of heavy lifting. I hope you are truly prepared for the weight of it." I turned to my mother, holding her cold stare without flinching. "Goodbye, Mother. Enjoy your inheritance. I am sure it is exactly what you deserve after all these years." Without waiting for their response, I turned on my heel and walked out of the mahogany-paneled office. The heavy wooden door clicked shut firmly behind me, cutting off the toxic atmosphere of the room. I walked down the long carpeted hallway of the law firm, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floorboards. The air outside the building hit me like a wave of pure energy. I did not feel defeated. I did not feel humiliated. I felt utterly invincible. I pulled my phone from my pocket and typed the alphanumeric sequence from the bills into a secure decryption application I had built myself years ago. The screen immediately blinked green. The output was a single name and a vault number at the oldest Black-owned private bank in Atlanta. My father had not left me out of his will. He had handed me the master key to the entire empire. hidden in plain sight, knowing Trey and my mother would be too blinded by their own greed and superiority to ever look closely at a small stack of cash. I hailed a black car and gave the driver the address to the bank. The real game was just beginning, and my family had absolutely no idea what was coming for them. The black car pulled up to the curb of a historic building made of solid granite and reinforced pride. This was the First Citizens Trust, the oldest black-owned private bank in Atlanta, a place where legacies were guarded with more than just steel vaults. I stepped out, my fingers trembling slightly as I clutched the envelope containing my father's final riddle. The sidewalk was bustling with professionals in tailored suits, but I felt like I was walking through a dream. I pushed through the heavy brass doors, and the cool, climate-controlled air of the lobby hit me like a splash of cold water. I bypassed the standard teller lines and walked straight toward the executive offices at the back. A receptionist looked up, her expression professional yet questioning. I didn't say a word. I simply pulled one of the $10 bills from my envelope and placed it face down on her desk, exposing the ultraviolet cipher. Her eyes widened, and without asking for my name, she stood up and signaled for me to follow her. She led me to a corner office where the name Isaiah Montgomery was etched in gold lettering on the glass. Mr. Isaiah was a legend in the Atlanta financial world. He had handled my father's most sensitive accounts for 40 years. When I entered, he was reviewing a stack of documents, his dark skin contrasting sharply with his crisp white hair. I stepped forward and laid all 9 $10 bills on his desk in a perfect row. He looked at the bills, then at me, and then he went completely pale. Without a word, he reached over and pressed a button under his desk. I heard the heavy deadbolt of his office door click into place. "Your father told me to wait for this exact serial sequence," Isaiah whispered, his voice thick with a mixture of reverence and relief. He sat back, his hands clasped over his chest. "He told me that if things went the way he feared, you would be the only one smart enough to find the path he paved for you." He called it the failsafe. He stood up and walked to a painting of a landscape on the far wall. He moved it aside to reveal a high-tech biometric scanner. After he scanned his palm, a small drawer slid open, revealing a heavy iron key with the number 90 engraved on the handle. He signaled for me to follow him into the depths of the bank. We descended 2 flights of stairs into a high-security vault area that felt like a fortress. The air was silent and heavy with the scent of old paper and ozone. We stopped in front of a small, inconspicuous locker labeled Box 90. I inserted the key, and with a heavy mechanical thud, the door swung open. Inside was a single thick leather binder embossed with the words, "Apex Shadow Trust." My hands were shaking as I pulled it out and set it on a viewing table. Isaiah stood back, giving me space, though his eyes remained fixed on the binder. As I flipped through the pages, the sheer genius of my father's plan began to unfold. It was a masterpiece of financial engineering. The $200 million that Trey and my mother were currently celebrating in the lawyer's office was nothing more than surface fluff. It was the liquid cash and the visible real estate, the shiny toys meant to distract them. But the Apex Trust held something far more valuable. It held the golden shares. These were the specific shares that carried absolute voting rights over every subsidiary of Sterling Logistics and Holdings. According to these documents, the Apex Trust was the parent entity of everything, and the sole executor of the trust was not the CEO of the company. It was the holder of the bearer token. By handing me those $90, my father hadn't just given me a gift. He had handed me the steering wheel of the entire empire. He knew Trey was an incompetent narcissist who would run the business into the ground within a year. He knew my mother was too blinded by social standing to stop him. He had designed this trust to act as a silent predator, waiting for the exact moment the company needed a real leader to step in and seize control. I realized then that while Trey thought he was the king of the mountain, he was actually standing on a platform that I now controlled. I had the power to veto board decisions, fire executives, and most importantly, I had the power to call in the debts that the main company owed to the Shadow Trust. My father had left Trey the fame, but he had left me the fire. I looked up at Isaiah, who was watching me with a knowing smile. He knew the chaos that was about to erupt in the Sterling family, and he looked like he had been waiting years for this moment. "Your father didn't want you to just inherit a fortune. Charmaine, Isaiah said softly. He wanted you to earn the right to protect it. He knew you were the only one with the backbone to do it. I felt a surge of cold, hard clarity. My entire life I had been the girl who wasn't enough, the girl who was too focused on her own path. But my father had seen me. He had seen my struggle and my strength, and he had placed the ultimate weapon in my hands. I wasn't just a software developer anymore. I was the silent owner of everything Trey thought he had stolen. I closed the binder, my mind already racing with the legal maneuvers I needed to execute. I needed to move fast before Trey did something irreparable. I shook Isaiah's hand and turned to leave the vault, the heavy binder tucked firmly under my arm. But as I stepped back into the lobby of the bank, the quiet peace of the moment was shattered. My phone began to vibrate violently in my purse. I pulled it out and saw a string of urgent messages from Marcus, my lead developer and closest friend. My heart skipped a beat as I read the text. It was an emergency. Trey just showed up at our office with 3 building security guards, Marcus wrote. He's not waiting until tomorrow. He's literally in the server room right now. He told the guards to start ripping out the cables and throwing our hardware into the hallway. Charmaine, he's destroying everything. He's laughing while he does it. He said he's cleaning out the trash. I felt a wave of white-hot rage wash over me. Trey wasn't just trying to evict me anymore. He was trying to murder my life's work. He wanted to see me broken and begging for his mercy. He thought he could use his new title to bully me into submission before I even had a chance to breathe. He had no idea that I was no longer the little sister he could push around. I looked back at the bank doors, then at the binder in my hand. The time for hiding and decoding puzzles was over. The failsafe had been triggered. Trey wanted to play dirty and he wanted to do it in public. He thought he was the one with the power to evict me, but he was about to find out that he didn't even own the chair he was sitting on. I didn't call the police. I didn't call my mother to beg for her to stop him. Instead, I dialed a number that was listed on the first page of the Apex Trust documents. It was the direct line to the private security firm that handled the entire Sterling commercial portfolio. "This is Charmaine Sterling," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "I am the sole executor of the Apex Trust. I have an unauthorized trespasser at my property on Peachtree Street. I want a tactical team there in 5 minutes. Do not ask questions. Just look at the ownership registry for Section 4B and get moving. I am on my way." I stepped out onto the street and flagged down the first taxi I saw. "My name is Charmaine, and I am the woman who is about to take back her father's legacy, one room at a time." The $80–90 inheritance was about to become the most expensive mistake Trey Sterling ever made. I watched the city of Atlanta blur past the window, my grip on the leather binder tightening. My brother wanted a war, and he thought he was attacking a defenseless target. He had no clue that he had just invited a hurricane into his house. I checked my watch. Trey had exactly 4 minutes of arrogance left, before his world turned upside down. I barely waited for the taxi to come to a complete stop in front of the Sterling Heights Tower before I threw a $20 bill at the driver and bolted toward the glass entrance. My heart was thundering against my ribs, but it wasn't from fear. It was the adrenaline of a woman who finally had the high ground. As I pushed through the revolving doors, the first thing I heard was the sharp, jagged sound of Trey's laughter echoing through the marble lobby. The scene was even more chaotic than Marcus had described. 3 heavy-set security guards were hauling black server towers out of the service elevator, stacking them carelessly on the cold floor like they were blocks of scrap metal. One of the monitors I had paid for with 3 months of ramen noodles was lying face down, its screen spider-webbed with cracks. Standing in the center of the mess were Trey and Sasha. They weren't just supervising, they were celebrating. Trey was holding a bottle of expensive champagne in one hand and a crystal flute in the other, while Sasha was filming the destruction on her phone, likely preparing a post for her followers about cleaning out the clutter. Trey looked up and saw me. His grin widened, flashing those expensive veneers that my father's hard work had paid for. "Well, look who decided to join the party!" He shouted over the sound of a server rack hitting the floor with a sickening metallic thud. "You are just in time for the grand opening of my new vision for this floor. I decided your little basement project was lowering the property value." I walked straight up to him, stepping over a tangle of severed power cables. "Stop this right now, Trey. You have no legal right to touch this equipment. We have a valid lease agreement through the end of the year. Trey took a slow, deliberate sip of his champagne before pouring a small puddle of it onto one of my shipping crates. Not anymore, little sister. See, as the new CEO of Sterling Logistics and Holdings, I did a little audit. It turns out your rent was being subsidized by Dad's personal charity fund. I decided that charity starts at home, and I am not feeling very charitable toward you today. I have officially tripled the rent for this suite effective as of 9 o'clock this morning. Since you failed to provide the security deposit for the new rate, you are in default. That means you are officially evicted. Sasha stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply against the marble. She shoved her phone camera inches from my face, her eyes gleaming with malice. Say cheese, Charmaine. I want everyone to see what happens when you try to play boss lady without the bank account to back it up. Honestly, you should be thanking Trey. He is finally forcing you to grow up. This is what you get for being so ungrateful. I looked at the guards, who were looking increasingly uncomfortable. He told us he had the paperwork, one of them muttered, refusing to meet my eyes. Trey stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, venomous hiss. This is what you get for dropping out of that MBA program at Wharton, just to play independent woman in a warehouse. You always thought you were smarter than me, just because you could write some lines of code. You were always a jealous, bitter loser who couldn't handle the fact that I was the one Dad chose to lead. Now you can take your $90 and go buy a tent because you are never stepping foot in this building again. The cruelty in his voice was familiar. It was the same tone he used when he broke my trophies in middle school, the same tone he used when he told our parents I was stealing from the pantry to hide his own binge drinking. For 20 years, I had absorbed his blows, waiting for someone to step in and tell him he was wrong. But the man who used to protect me was gone, and the woman who birthed us was currently choosing which designer gown to wear to Trey's inauguration. I was completely on my own, and for the first time in my life, that was exactly where I wanted to be. I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't beg. I simply reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. Trey rolled his eyes, turning back to Sasha. Oh, look, she is probably calling Mom to tattle. Go ahead, Charmaine. Mom is busy at the spa. She blocked your number an hour ago. I ignored him and dialed the direct extension for Sterling Property Management. I knew the man on the other end of the line. His name was Gerald, and he had been managing this specific tower for 15 years. He was a man of rules and registries, and he knew exactly who really signed his paychecks. Gerald, it is. Charmaine Sterling, I said, my voice cutting through the noise of the lobby like a laser. I am standing in the lobby of the Heights Tower. I have a major security breach and a trespasser on the premises. I need you to dispatch the elite tactical response team to the 4th floor immediately. Trey snorted, nearly spilling his champagne. Tactical response. You have lost your mind. I am the CEO, you idiot. I am the one who gives Gerald orders. I kept my eyes on Trey as I continued into the phone. Gerald checked the ownership registry for Section 4B. Look at the title holder listed under the Apex Shadow Trust. Verify the bearer token serial number I just messaged to your secure terminal. Do it right now. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the rapid clicking of a keyboard. Then I heard Gerald's breath hitch. Ms. Sterling, he stammered, his voice suddenly stripped of its professional cool. I see it. The registry was updated 10 minutes ago. I had no idea. Execute the trespass order, Gerald. I want everyone who is not on my approved employee list cleared from the floor and the lobby. That includes Trey Sterling. Use whatever force is necessary to protect my equipment. I hung up the phone and crossed my arms. Trey was looking at me with a mixture of confusion and growing irritation. What kind of stunt are you trying to pull? You think Gerald is going to listen to you over me? I am the one with the millions, Charmaine. I am the one whose name is on the front of the building. Actually, Trey, your name is on the sign, I said, stepping closer until I could smell the expensive gin on his breath. But if you had ever bothered to read the fine print of Dad's filings, you would know that the sign is just a decorative ornament. You see, Dad knew you would try something like this. He knew your ego wouldn't let you just sit still and be rich. He knew you would try to destroy me the second he wasn't here to hold your hand. Sasha scoffed, waving her hand dismissively. You are delusional. You are literally standing in the middle of your own trash. You lost. Just accept it and walk away with what's left of your dignity. The sound of heavy boots hitting the marble floor echoed from the stairwell. A team of 6 men in black tactical gear, armed with non-lethal deterrents and wearing the Sterling security insignia, marched into the lobby. They didn't stop at the reception desk. They headed straight for our group. Trey straightened his suit jacket, putting on his best CEO face. "About time you guys got here," he barked at the lead officer. "My sister is having some kind of mental episode and interfering with a legal eviction. Get her out of here." The lead officer didn't even look at Trey. He walked straight to me and snapped a crisp salute. "Ms. Sterling, the floor is secure. We have halted the removal of the equipment. My men are currently documented the damage for the insurance claim against the Sterling Holdings insurance bond." Trey's jaw dropped so far I thought it might hit the floor. "What are you doing? I am the CEO. I am your boss." The officer finally turned to Trey, his expression completely flat. "Sir, our contract is held by the Apex Trust. We take orders from the executor of that trust. As of 10 minutes ago, that is Ms. Charmaine Sterling. You, however, are not on the authorized access list for this property." I leaned in, whispering so only Trey could hear me. "Remember how you said $90 was enough for my internet bill? Well, it turns out it was actually enough to buy the company that owns the ground you are standing on." Trey's face turned a deep, mottled purple. "This is a mistake. My mother will hear about this. You can't do this to me." I turned to the lead officer. "Sir, Mr. Sterling is trespassing and creating a public disturbance. Please escort him and his wife off the property immediately. If they resist, feel free to use the standard protocol for hostile intruders." Sasha started to scream as a guard grabbed her arm, but the sound was cut short as they were marched toward the revolving doors. I stood there, surrounded by my broken servers and tangled cables, watching my brother be dragged out of his own lobby in front of every employee in the building. He was shouting threats, his face twisted in a mask of pure, impotent rage. I looked down at the spider-webbed screen of my favorite monitor. It was broken, but it could be replaced. Everything could be replaced. I pulled out my phone and sent a one-word message to Mr. Isaiah at the bank. Proceed. I knew Trey would go straight to our mother. I knew the real war was just beginning. But as I watched the security team set up a perimeter around my office, I knew one thing for sure. The Sterling family thought they had buried me. They just didn't realize I was the one holding the shovel, and I wasn't done digging. My name is Charmaine, and I was about to show my mother that her golden child was made of nothing but cheap spray paint and debt. I walked toward the elevator, the binder from the vault tucked under my arm, ready to move to the next phase of my father's masterpiece. Trey had lost his building, but by tomorrow morning, he was going to lose a lot more than that. I pressed the button for the penthouse. It was time to see what else the Apex Trust owned. Trey stood tall in the middle of the lobby, adjusting his silk tie with a triumphant smirk as the heavy doors hissed open. A squad of 8 elite security officers, clad in tactical gear with the Apex security insignia, marched in with synchronized precision. Their boots echoed like drum beats against the polished marble. Trey's eyes lit up, a predatory glint appearing as he pointed a trembling finger toward me. "About time you losers showed up," he barked, his voice dripping with newfound authority. "My sister is having a delusional episode and trespassing on company property. I want her and her little band of basement nerds out of my building right now. Do not be gentle." Sasha leaned against a decorative pillar, her phone held high to capture my public downfall for her social media feed. She was practically vibrating with excitement, her face twisted into a mask of cruel satisfaction. "Get a good angle of her being dragged out," Trey shouted to her, his ego inflating by the second. "I want every single one of our father's old friends to see exactly what happens to the black sheep of the Sterling family when they try to step out of line." The lead captain, a mountain of a man named Captain Graves, didn't stop to acknowledge Trey's commands. He didn't even look at me. He led his team straight into the center of the lobby, forming a perimeter that effectively cut Trey and Sasha off from the exit. Trey's smirk grew even wider, thinking the net was closing in on me. But as Graves approached, he didn't turn toward the elevator where my staff was huddled. Instead, he stepped directly into Trey's personal space. The air in the lobby seemed to freeze. Trey's hand was still extended, pointing at me, but his fingers began to tremble as Captain Graves reached out. With a grip that looked like it could crush granite, Graves clamped his hand onto Trey's bicep. "Sir, you are currently in violation of a high-level trespass order," Graves said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the room. "I need you to release that champagne glass and prepare for an immediate escort from the premises." Trey's jaw dropped. The glass of vintage bubbly slipped from his numb fingers, shattering on the marble floor with a sharp, violent crack. The liquid splattered his expensive shoes, but he didn't even blink. "What the hell are you doing?" he shrieked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "I am Trey Sterling. I am the CEO of Sterling Logistics. I am your boss. You work for me. You release me this instant, or I will have your badge and your pension by sunset." Captain Graves didn't flinch. Behind him, two other officers moved toward Sasha. She let out a piercing scream as they stepped between her and her camera. "Put the phone down, ma'am," one of them commanded. "This is a private enforcement action. You are being removed from the property." I stepped forward, the heavy leather binder from the bank tucked securely under my arm. The silence in the lobby was absolute, save for the hum of the air conditioning and the frantic breathing of my brother. I looked at Trey, seeing him for exactly what he was. A spoiled child playing with a toy he didn't understand. "This building isn't part of your inheritance." "Trey," I said, my voice calm and clear, carrying to every corner of the room where my employees and the building staff were watching. "You see, Dad was much smarter than you ever gave him credit for. He knew you looked at the world as a series of labels and titles. You saw the Sterling name on the skyscraper and assumed it belonged to the company you were inheriting. But Dad spent 30 years moving the actual soil and steel into a separate bucket." Trey struggled against Graves's grip, his face turning a deep mottled purple. "You are lying. Everything Dad owned came to me and Mom. The lawyer said it. The will said it. You got $90, you pathetic loser. You got $90 and a slap in the face." I pulled one of the $10 bills from my pocket and held it up, letting the light catch the UV cipher. $90 was the key to the Apex Trust tray. And the Apex Trust owns the land, the air rights, and the physical structure of every commercial property in the Sterling portfolio. Sterling Logistics is just a tenant here, and as the sole executor of Apex, a role I officially assumed 10 minutes ago at First Citizens Bank, I am your landlord. Trey stopped, struggling for a heartbeat, his eyes darting to the binder under my arm. The realization began to sink in, turning his skin a sickly pale gray. Sasha was frozen, her phone finally lowered, her mouth hanging open in a silent gasp. "You violated the terms of the master lease by interfering with a subtenant." I continued, gesturing to my broken servers on the floor. "You engaged in unauthorized property damage and attempted an illegal eviction without a court order. As the landlord, I am exercising my right to terminate the master lease for this floor and revoke your executive access to the building's secure zones. You are permanently banned from this premises, Trey. Not just today, not just this floor. You are persona non grata in every building owned by the Sterling name." "Captain Graves," I said, looking the captain in the eye, "please escort these trespassers to the street. If they return, treat them as hostile intruders." Graves nodded once. "Move out," he barked. Trey finally found his voice again, but it wasn't the voice of a CEO. It was the scream of a cornered animal. "You can't do this. I'll sue you. I'll tie you up in court for the next 50 years. You think you've won? You think a few papers from a dead man make you the boss?" Graves began to pull him toward the elevators, his boots dragging against the marble. Trey's heels left long, squealing scuffs on the floor he thought he owned. Sasha was being led right behind him, her designer heels clicking frantically as she tried to maintain her balance. The employees who had been terrified minutes ago were now pulling out their own phones, recording the spectacle of the golden child being handled like a common criminal. Trey's face was contorted with a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred as the elevator doors began to slide open. He looked back at me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "You're dead in this town, Charmaine. You hear me, dead. I'm calling Mom right now. She's going to blackball you from every investor circle in Atlanta. She's going to tell everyone you stole from Dad's deathbed. You'll never raise another dime for your little tech toy. You won't be able to buy a sandwich in this city by the time she's done with you. The doors began to close, but his voice echoed through the gap filled with a desperate, jagged malice. I'm going to make sure you have nothing. Nothing. You'll be begging me for that $90 back before the week is over. The elevator dived, taking his screams with it. The lobby fell into a heavy, ringing silence. My lead developer, Marcus, stepped forward from the server room, his eyes wide as he looked at the shattered champagne glass, and then at me. Charmaine, he whispered, his voice shaking. What just happened? Did you really just kick the CEO of the company out of his own building? I looked down at the binder in my hands. The weight of it felt different now. It wasn't just a shield, it was a ledger. And Trey was right about one thing. My mother, Valerie, was the true power in the social and financial circles of the black elite. She didn't fight with her fists, or even with security guards. She fought with reputations. She fought with whispered words at the country club and closed doors at the charity galas. She would see this as a declaration of war against her legacy and her favorite child. She would move to cut off my oxygen, to isolate me, and to starve my business, until I crawled back to her to beg for forgiveness. I turned to Marcus and the rest of my team. Start cleaning up the equipment, I said, my voice unwavering. Document every scratch, every broken cable. We are filing a civil suit against Trey Sterling personally for the damages. And Marcus, get the servers back online. We have a lot of work to do. Where are you going? Marcus asked as I headed back toward the brass entrance. To get ahead of the story, I replied. I stepped out into the Atlanta heat, the sun beating down on the pavement. My brother thought he was going to run to Mom and have her fix his problems. He didn't realize that I knew her playbook better than he did. She had spent my entire life teaching me that image was everything. Well, it was time to show the world the image of the Sterling family that she had worked so hard to hide. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't call the bank. I opened my contacts and dialed a number I hadn't touched in 3 years. It was the lead editor at the Atlanta Business Chronicle, a woman who had been trying to get an inside scoop on the Sterling transition for months. Sharon, this is Charmaine Sterling, I said as soon as she picked up. I have a story for you. It's about a billion-dollar inheritance, a shadow trust, and a CEO who just got escorted out of his own lobby in handcuffs. Are you interested? I hung up and felt the first true breath of freedom I'd had since my father passed. Trey thought Mom was his ultimate weapon. He didn't realize that I was the one holding the evidence of where the money actually came from. And if Valerie Sterling wanted to blackball me, she was going to have to do it while the entire city was reading about her son's gambling debts and the secret will that left him with nothing but a title. I stepped into a waiting car, the next move already mapped out in my mind. The war had just begun, but I was already 3 steps ahead of the Queen Mother. I knew Valerie Sterling wouldn't just sit back and watch her favorite son be humiliated. She lived by a code of optics and reputation, and I had just shattered the stained glass image of her perfect family. By the time I reached my apartment, the air in Atlanta had already shifted. My phone was blowing up with notifications from group chats I hadn't looked at in years. The whispers had started. By the next morning, those whispers had turned into a coordinated roar. My mother didn't bother with a direct confrontation. She used her influence like a scalpel, cutting me out of the very fabric of the city. I heard from a friend that Valerie had spent the evening making calls to the most powerful women in the Jack and Jill circles and the influential elders at the Ebenezer megachurch. The narrative was being rewritten in real time. According to the version being spun in every high-end salon and country club lounge, I had suffered a massive mental breakdown following my father's death. They were claiming that in my grief-induced instability, I had forged documents to harass my grieving brother and steal company assets. The smear campaign was surgical. It wasn't just about social standing. It was about financial strangulation. At exactly 9:30 a.m., I received 2 back-to-back emails that made my blood run cold. My 2 primary venture capital investors, men who had sat at my father's dinner table for decades, were pulling their Series A funding. The reason cited was a standard morality and stability clause. They claimed that the rumors of my legal battle with the Sterling estate made me too high risk for their portfolio. In reality, I knew Valerie had simply whispered in their ears that a vote for Charmaine was a vote against the entire Sterling legacy. Just as I was staring at the loss of $4 million in operating capital, my phone rang. It was my mother. I debated letting it go to voicemail, but I needed to hear the sound of her desperation. Charmaine, she said, her voice sounding like velvet wrapped around a blade. I hope you've had a restful morning. I assume you've seen the news regarding your little business venture. It's such a shame when a lack of discretion leads to such unfortunate consequences. I leaned back in my chair looking at the city skyline. I assume you're calling to congratulate me on my new property acquisitions, Mother. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end. Do not be arrogant. You are playing a game you cannot win. You have alienated everyone who matters. Your investors are gone, and by the end of the week your reputation will be unsalvageable. However, because I am your mother, I am willing to offer you a way out of this darkness. I weighted my finger tracing the edge of the leather binder from the bank. Give the building back to Trey, Valerie commanded. Sign a public statement admitting that you misunderstood the will and apologize for the distress you've caused your brother. If you do that today, I will make a few calls. Your funding will be restored by tomorrow morning, and I will tell everyone that this was all just a tragic misunderstanding brought on by your mourning process. It's time to come home and be a daughter again, Charmaine. Stop this foolishness before there is nothing left of you to save. The cruelty of the offer was breathtaking. She wanted me to lobotomize my own success and crawl back into the shadow of Trey's mediocrity just to keep my company alive. She thought she had me cornered because she looked at my business as a hobby that required her permission to exist. She didn't realize that my company wasn't just an app. It was a weapon. I won't be signing anything, Mother, I said, my voice cold and steady. And you might want to tell Trey to stop spending his inheritance. It's a lot harder to pay back money that was never actually yours. Charmaine. If you hang up this phone, there is no coming back, she hissed. You will be a stranger to this family and this city. I already was, Mother. Goodbye. I ended the call and felt a strange sense of peace. The bridge wasn't just burned, I had demolished the foundations. I turned back to my dual monitor setup in my home office. My team was still at the building, protected by Apex security, but the funding freeze meant I had exactly 60 days of runway left before we went under. Valerie thought she had cut off my oxygen, but she had forgotten that I built my company on the back of data. I opened the back end of my fintech software, a platform I had originally designed to track high-frequency market anomalies. But today, I wasn't looking at the stock market. I was looking at the Sterling family ledger. During my years at the company, I had secretly mapped out the interconnected web of my father's private accounts, Trey's corporate spending, and Sasha's offshore consulting fees. I initiated a deep dive trace, a digital forensic audit that used AI to scrub through every public filing, every property lien, and every credit account associated with Trey Sterling and Sasha Sterling. If they wanted to claim I was the one who was unstable and fraudulent, I was going to let the numbers tell a different story. I spent the next 4 hours watching the data stream across my screen. Most people see money as a solid thing, but to a developer, money is just a trail of digital crumbs. I followed those crumbs through shell companies in Delaware and suspicious transfers to luxury casinos in Macau. My father had left Trey the keys to a billion-dollar company, but Trey had been treating it like a personal piggy bank long before Dad breathed his last. As the final report compiled, a series of red flags began to pop up on my dashboard. I clicked into Trey's personal debt profile and my eyes widened. He hadn't just been losing money, he had been hemorrhaging it. To hide his losses from our father, he had engaged in a series of predatory margin loans, using Sterling Holdings stock as collateral. But because the stock price had dipped recently due to his poor leadership, those loans were now underwater. Then I moved to Sasha's accounts. I found a string of payments to a boutique law firm that specialized in estate modification. My heart skipped a beat. They hadn't just been waiting for Dad to die, they had been preparing to bypass me for years. But the real shocker came when I looked at the most recent activity on the Sterling Holdings master account. Just 3 hours after the will reading, Trey had attempted to move $50 million from the corporate reserve into a private account in the Cayman Islands. The transfer had been flagged and put on a 48-hour hold because it lacked a secondary signature, my father's signature. Trey was trying to loot the company before the dust even settled. He was desperate, he was broke, and he was terrified. I looked at the final summary of their personal net worth. On paper, they were the elite of Atlanta. In reality, Trey and Sasha were currently floating on a bubble of debt so thin that a single pinprick would burst it. They didn't have millions in the bank, they had millions in liabilities. And the only thing keeping them afloat was the perceived value of the Sterling name, a name I now legally controlled through the Apex Trust. I leaned back in my chair, a sharp, genuine laugh bubbling up in my throat. It was the laugh of someone who had just realized their captors were actually the ones trapped in the cage. My mother was out there destroying my reputation to protect a son who was currently committing corporate embezzlement to pay off his gambling debts. She was fighting for a kingdom that was already bankrupt. I looked at a photo of my father on my desk. He hadn't left me $90 as a test of my patience. He had left it to me because he knew that with my brain and his resources, I would be the only one to see the truth. He had left Trey and my mother the millions because he knew those millions were actually a death sentence of debt and legal ruin. He had handed them the poison and handed me the cure. I picked up the phone and called Marcus. Marcus, forget the investors, I said, my voice buzzing with energy. We don't need their 4 million. We are about to have access to a lot more than that. I need you to gather the legal team. I've just found 50 million reasons why Trey Sterling is going to prison, and I have the digital receipts to prove it. But Charmaine, what about your mom? Marcus asked. She's still out there telling everyone you're crazy. I looked at the screen where the red warning lights were still flashing. Let her talk, I replied. Because by the time I'm done with this trace, the only thing people in this city will be talking about is how the Golden Boy turned the Sterling legacy into a crime scene. I felt a surge of adrenaline. I wasn't just defending my company anymore. I was preparing to liquidate my brother's life. I started typing, my fingers flying across the keys as I began to draft the formal notice of debt acquisition. Valerie thought she was the one squeezing me. She had no idea I was about to buy her son's soul. I clicked execute on the final search parameters, ready to see just how deep the rabbit hole went. What I saw next made me freeze. Trey wasn't just in debt to the banks. He was in debt to people who didn't use lawyers to collect. This was going to be much more explosive than a boardroom fight. I clicked execute on the final search parameters, ready to see just how deep the rabbit hole went. What I saw next made me freeze. Trey wasn't just in debt to the banks. He was in debt to people who didn't use lawyers to collect. This was going to be much more explosive than a boardroom fight. As the data poured across my monitors, I realized that Trey was suffering from a terminal case of delusions of grandeur. He truly believed that the CEO title was a magic wand that had turned him into a billionaire overnight. He was acting like a man who had won the lottery, unaware that the ticket was counterfeit, and the taxman was already at the door. While I was calculating my next move from my home office, Trey was out in the world burning through money that didn't exist. My software flagged a massive high-interest margin loan he had just secured from a predatory private equity firm. He had used his supposed majority stake in Sterling Holdings as collateral. The interest rate was astronomical. A desperate move by a man trying to silence underground gambling creditors, who were likely breathing down his neck. He was taking out a loan to pay off a debt, using a ghost of an inheritance as his shield. He was digging a hole to fill a hole, and the walls were already starting to crumble. Sasha was even worse. While Trey was drowning in debt, she was drowning in vanity. I watched through the digital lens of her social media as she gave a live tour of a $15 million mansion in Buckhead. It was a sprawling estate with white marble columns and a pool that looked like a lake. This is the Sterling lifestyle, she boasted to her 30,000 viewers. Twirling around the grand foyer with a glass of champagne, no basements, no glitches, just pure gold. Some people are born to lead and others are born to code in the dark. Better luck next life, Charmaine. The comments were a mix of fawning praise and bitter jealousy, but all I could do was laugh. I knew that the $15 million she was flaunting was actually a high-leverage bridge loan that I now technically own through the Apex Trust. Every time she touched a gold-plated faucet in that house, she was essentially borrowing from me. Every brick in that mansion was a liability on a ledger that I was currently auditing. They were living in a house of cards during a hurricane, and they were too arrogant to feel the wind. My father had set a masterpiece in motion. By giving them the surface assets, he had given them the freedom to destroy themselves. He knew that Trey would never look at the debt profile of the company. He knew Valerie would never question the source of the money as long as the gala invitations kept coming. They were spending borrowed time and stolen money, and the bill was coming due. I spent the rest of the afternoon setting the final traps. Using my fintech platform, I didn't just track their spending. I began to quietly acquire their personal liabilities. When Trey's gambling debts were sold to a third-party collection agency, I bought them. When Sasha's jeweler flagged a missed payment on her new 6-carat earrings, I stepped in as the primary creditor. I was slowly becoming the ghost in their machine, the invisible hand that held the strings to their entire existence. I wasn't just a sister anymore. I was their bank, their landlord, and their judge. The irony was delicious. My mother was out in the community telling everyone I was a forged document-wielding fraud who had lost her mind. She was painting me as a girl who was broke and desperate. Meanwhile, I was sitting in my pajamas, drinking cold coffee and literally owning the very clothes on her back. I was the silent partner in their destruction. I didn't need to shout to be heard. I just needed to wait for the numbers to hit zero. Just as the sun began to set over Atlanta, a formal digital invitation popped up in my inbox. It was embossed with the gold seal of the Atlanta Founders Gala. This was the most prestigious event of the year, the night where the Black elite gathered to celebrate legacy, power, and wealth. The invitation listed Valerie Sterling and Trey Sterling as the guests of honor. They were being recognized for their seamless transition of the Sterling Empire and their philanthropic contributions to the city. The gala was scheduled for tomorrow night at the St. Regis. It was the perfect stage for them to cement the lie they had been telling about me. Trey would give a speech about his father's vision. My mother would accept an award for her decades of service. Sasha would wear a dress that cost more than a teacher's yearly salary, and they would all smile for the cameras, proving to the world that they had successfully pruned the black sheep from the family tree. I stared at the screen for a long time. My initial instinct was to stay away, to keep working in the shadows until the legal proceedings were finalized. But then I looked at the data on my screen one more time. Trey's margin loan was set to be called in 48 hours if the stock price didn't stabilize. The mansion in Buckhead was technically in pre-foreclosure because the initial wire transfer from the corporate account had been blocked by my Apex Trust override. They were going to that gala to celebrate a life that was already gone. They were going to walk into that ballroom as royalty, completely unaware that the guards at the door were now on my payroll. I stood up and walked to my closet. Tucked away in the back was a floor-length emerald green silk gown that I had bought for my father's 70th birthday party, a party I was eventually uninvited from because Sasha didn't want me in the family photo. I pulled it out and felt the weight of the fabric. Valerie and Trey wanted a public victory. They wanted to use the gala to finalize my social execution. They wanted to show the world that I didn't belong at the table. Well, they were right about one thing. I didn't belong at their table. I owned the room. I decided it was time to crash the party. Not as the grieving, unstable daughter they had described, but as the woman who held the deed to their lives. I wasn't going there to argue. I was going there to foreclose. I picked up my phone and called a high-end styling service. I wanted to look like the billionaire my father knew I was. I also sent one final encrypted message to Mr. Isaiah at First Citizens Bank. Isaiah, I need the physical copies of the debt acquisition certificates and the Apex Trust appointment letters. I want them in a leather portfolio delivered to my door by noon tomorrow. Also tell the security detail at the St. Regis that there will be a change to the VIP entrance list. As I hung up, I felt a calm, cold fire burning in my chest. Trey and Sasha had spent the last week mocking me on the internet. My mother had spent her life making me feel like a second-class citizen in my own home. They thought they were the guests of honor, but they were actually the main attraction in a tragedy they hadn't finished writing yet. I looked at the Instagram Live notification that popped up on my phone. Sasha was showing off her jewelry again. "Take a good look, Sasha," I whispered to the empty room. "Because tomorrow night, the lights are going out." The stage was set. The villains were blinded by their own reflected glory. The debt spiral had reached its terminal velocity. All that was left was for me to walk through the door and pull the lever. Atlanta was about to witness the biggest fall from grace in the history of the Sterling name, and I was going to be the one standing in the center of the debris. I spent the rest of the night practicing my speech. Not for the gala, but for the moment I looked my mother in the eye and told her exactly how much she owed me. It was time for the Sterling family to have a real conversation about legacy, and I was going to be the only one with the truth on my side. I went to bed and slept better than I had in years. The black sheep was done hiding. The wolf had arrived. The St. Regis ballroom was a sea of shimmering gold and deep obsidian. The annual Atlanta Founders Gala was the pinnacle of the city's social calendar, a night where every smile was a strategic move and every diamond was a statement of power. As I stepped out of my black car, the emerald green silk of my gown caught the flashes of a dozen cameras. I didn't rush. I walked up the red carpet with the poise of a woman who already knew the ending of the movie everyone else was just starting to watch. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive lilies and even more expensive perfume. I spotted them almost immediately. My mother Valerie was the center of a prestigious circle that included the mayor and several prominent city council members. She looked radiant in a silver gown that screamed tradition. Trey stood beside her looking every bit the part of the powerful new CEO, while Sasha clung to his arm draped in enough lace and sequins to outfit a small army. I didn't wait for an invitation. I drifted toward their circle, my heels silent on the plush carpet. The mayor was mid-sentence when he saw me, his eyebrows shooting up in surprise. Valerie's smile didn't slip, but her eyes turned into twin chips of ice. "Oh, Charmaine," she said, her voice loud enough to be caught by everyone nearby. "I see you decided to come after all. I was just telling the mayor that you are going through a bit of a rebellious phase lately. It is so difficult when young people struggle with the pressures of their little apps and hobbies. We are all praying for your recovery." A few people in the circle chuckled nervously. It was a masterclass in social execution. In 10 seconds, she had neutralized my presence, labeling me as mentally unstable and insignificant. Trey let out a smug, condescending huff. "Don't worry, Mom. Some people just aren't built for the big leagues." Sasha, however, wasn't content with words. As I reached for a glass of water from a passing server, she performed a clumsy theatrical stumble. With a sharp flick of her wrist, her glass of deep red Cabernet tilted the liquid soaking into the side of my emerald gown. "Oh my God, Charmaine, I am so sorry," she cried, her voice ringing with fake concern. "You know how these vintage floors can be. But then again, maybe that dress was just too heavy for you to handle." I didn't flinch. I didn't look down at the stain. I looked directly into Sasha's eyes, seeing the desperate insecurity beneath her heavy makeup. I leaned in as if I were about to whisper a secret between best friends. The mayor and the council members watched, confused by my lack of a scene. "At least I own my dress, Sasha." I whispered, my voice barely a breath against her ear. "How is that $15 million mortgage on the Buckhead house coming along?" "I noticed the wire transfer from the corporate reserve was blocked this morning." "And tell me, did you notice your wedding ring felt a little lighter lately? Because according to the pawn ledger I bought yesterday, Trey leveraged it to pay off his bookie in Vegas 3 nights ago." Sasha's face went from a triumphant smirk to a sickly ashen gray in less than a second. Her hand flew to her throat, her eyes darting to Trey, who was busy trying to charm a local bank executive. She looked like she was about to vomit. I pulled back, smoothing a stray hair from her shoulder with a mocking kindness. "Enjoy the gala, Sasha. The lights really do bring out the sparkle in those cubic zirconias you're wearing tonight." I turned and walked away, leaving her frozen in the middle of the elite circle. I could feel Valerie's eyes burning into my back, but I didn't stop. I headed toward the balcony, needing a moment of cool air before the final act. Behind me, the fallout began instantly. Sasha didn't have my composure. She grabbed Trey's arm so hard he nearly dropped his drink. I watched from the shadows near the balcony door as she dragged him toward the deserted hallway leading to the coat check. Her voice was a frantic, muffled hiss, but her frantic gestures told the whole story. She was panicking, throwing the reality of their bankruptcy in his face right there in the middle of their biggest night. Trey looked like he had been struck by lightning. His eyes went wide, scanning the room for me, but I was gone. He was trapped in a hallway with a wife who was realizing her golden life was a lie, and a crowd of investors who were waiting for him to return to the table. I watched through the glass as Trey pulled out his phone, his thumbs flying across the screen with a frantic, trembling energy. He wasn't calling a lawyer. He wasn't calling a friend. He was accessing the Sterling Logistics master payroll account. I saw the desperate set of his jaw. He was making a move to override the 48-hour hold on the $50 million offshore transfer. It was a direct illegal breach of fiduciary duty, a crime he was committing right outside a ballroom filled with the city's highest law enforcement officials. He thought he could move the money and cover his tracks before anyone noticed the rebellious daughter had actually dismantled his world. He was a cornered rat, and he had just taken the bait. He didn't realize that my phone was already vibrating in my hand, receiving a real-time alert from my fintech software. The digital signature he was using was being logged. Every keystroke was a nail in his coffin. I stepped out onto the balcony, the Atlanta skyline stretching out like a grid of light. The gala music was a distant hum. Trey was currently committing a felony to save a house he'd already lost, and Sasha was likely halfway to a nervous breakdown. My mother was inside, still playing the role of the grand matriarch, unaware that the foundation of her house was being liquidated in a hallway. They wanted a show. They wanted a public execution of my character. But as I watched the data stream across my phone, I knew the only execution happening tonight was the end of the Sterling family's reign. Trey had just made the one mistake I couldn't be accused of orchestrating. He had proven himself to be exactly what I always knew: he was a thief. I straightened my emerald gown, the red wine stain now looking like a badge of honor. It was time to go back inside and wait for the police to arrive. The Founders Gala was about to get an ending that no one, especially not my mother, would ever forget. I checked my watch. The transfer would hit the bank's fraud department in exactly 90 seconds. I took a deep breath of the night air and pushed the doors open, ready to watch the gold leaf peel off their lives. I took a deep breath of the night air and pushed the doors open, ready to watch the gold leaf peel off their lives. The music inside was reaching a crescendo, but all I could hear was the frantic ticking of a clock only I could see. I didn't return to the main circle. Instead, I retreated to a quiet alcove near the library, pulled out my laptop, and began the digital equivalent of a surgical strike. Trey thought he was playing a game of checkers, but I had already turned the board into a minefield. Through my fintech platform, I initiated the final phase of the covert operation I had been preparing for days. I knew Trey was suffocating. Between the underground bookies in Vegas, who didn't take kindly to delays, and Sasha's insatiable appetite for a life they couldn't afford, my brother was a walking target. He needed cash, and he needed it yesterday. My software had already flagged that his primary gambling debt, a staggering $4 million, had been packaged and sold to a high-risk collection agency. I didn't hesitate. Using a dummy corporation I had established months ago called Obsidian Capital, I moved with lightning speed. I didn't just want to watch Trey fail. I wanted to own his failure. With a few encrypted keystrokes and a wire transfer from the Apex Trust's liquidity reserve, Obsidian Capital bought every cent of Trey's personal debt. The bookies got their payout. The collection agency took their commission, and in the eyes of the law, I was now Trey's sole legal creditor. He didn't owe the sharks anymore. He owed me. And unlike the sharks, I wasn't interested in a payment plan. I was interested in total liquidation. I watched the confirmation icons turn green on my screen. It was a cold, clinical victory. Trey was currently back in the ballroom, probably ordering another round of top-shelf scotch to celebrate his successful offshore transfer, unaware that the very suit he was wearing technically belonged to a subsidiary of my company. I had effectively turned my brother into a tenant in his own life. But the data didn't stop there. My AI-driven monitor began to chime with a series of high-priority alerts. Trey's offshore transfer hadn't just been flagged. It had been blocked entirely by the bank's automated anti-money laundering protocol. He was officially trapped. He had no cash, no credit, and his creditors, or so he thought, were still closing in. I watched through the digital backdoor of his private emails as a new message thread appeared. It was from a representative of Vancorp Industries, the Sterling family's most bitter rival in the logistics sector. They had been trying to dismantle our father's empire for 2 decades, and now they saw their opening. Trey, in a move born of pure, unadulterated desperation, was responding to an offer to sell Sterling Logistics. My heart went cold. Sterling Logistics wasn't just a company, it was our father's soul. It was the fleet of trucks, the warehouses, and the thousands of families whose livelihoods depended on the Sterling name. And Trey was preparing to sell it for pennies on the dollar just to save his own skin. Because he was the CEO on paper. He thought he had the authority to sign away the core of the empire without a board vote. He was planning an emergency midnight sale, bypassing every legal safeguard our father had put in place. The alert on my screen was clear. Trey had just sent a digital invitation for an emergency strategic alignment meeting at the Sterling headquarters scheduled for 2 hours from now. He was going to meet the Vancorp executives in the dark, sign the papers, and flee with whatever finder's fee they promised him. He was ready to burn the entire forest just to keep his little campfire going. I felt a surge of adrenaline that made the red wine stain on my dress feel like war paint. He thought he was out of options, so he chose the most destructive one. He didn't realize that I wasn't just tracking his debt. I was tracking his soul. I closed my laptop and stood up, my emerald gown flowing behind me like a shadow. The gala was still in full swing. My mother was laughing at a joke made by the district attorney, her silver hair shimmering under the chandeliers. Sasha was back on the floor, her face still pale, but masked by a forced, jagged smile. They were all dancing on the deck of the Titanic, convinced they were the ones steering the ship. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't need to. I walked past them, my eyes fixed on the exit. Trey was already gone, having slipped out the back to meet his fate at the office. He thought he was about to secure his future. He didn't realize he was walking into a trap that had been set 22 years ago. The moment our father decided that the black sheep was the only one he could truly trust with the truth. I pulled out my phone and dialed Captain Graves. Graves, the target is moving to the headquarters for an unauthorized asset liquidation. I said, my voice as sharp as a razor. I want the tactical team in the boardroom before he arrives. Block all external server access and prepare to override the building's physical locks. Understood, Ms. Sterling. Graves replied. What about the Vancorp executives? Let them in, I said, a dark smile playing on my lips. I want them to have front row seats when the floor falls out from under him. I stepped out into the humid Atlanta night, the neon lights of the city reflecting in the puddles on the street. Trey was about to try and sell a ghost. He was about to sign a contract for a company that he no longer had the right to lead, backed by assets that I had already seized. He was walking into the final confrontation of his life, and he was doing it with a smile on his face. My name is Charmaine, and I was about to show my brother that you can't sell what you don't own, and you can't outrun a debt to the person you've spent your life trying to destroy. I hailed a car and gave the driver the address to the Sterling headquarters. The party was over. The audit was about to begin. I checked the real-time feed on my phone one last time. Trey's car was pulling into the corporate garage. He had exactly 15 minutes of delusion left. I leaned back in the seat, the leather binder of the Apex Trust resting on my lap like a heavy, silent judge. It was time to go home and end this. The Sterling Logistics headquarters loomed over the Atlanta skyline like a monument to my father's life. But tonight, it looked like a fortress under siege. As my car pulled up to the curb, I saw the swarm of news vans and black SUVs. Trey hadn't just called a meeting. He had turned this betrayal into a media circus. He was desperate to finalize the sale to Vancorp before the sun came up, hoping that a public announcement would make the deal too big to fail. I stepped out of the car, my emerald gown shimmering under the streetlights, and walked toward the main entrance. I could see Trey through the glass of the mezzanine, standing at a podium adjusting his microphone, while my mother Valerie stood regally behind him. She looked like a queen mother preparing to crown her successor, her face radiating a smug, misplaced pride. She truly believed that by selling the company, they were pivoting to a life of leisure, finally cutting away the burden of the business that I actually cared about. I reached the heavy glass doors and tapped my executive keycard against the scanner. Instead of the usual green chirp, the light flashed a defiant, angry red. I tried again, but the result was the same. Through the glass, I saw a line of private security guards I didn't recognize. These weren't Sterling employees. They were hired, muscle-wearing gray uniforms with no insignia. One of them stepped forward, tapping on the glass and shaking his head. "Access denied, Ms. Sterling," he shouted, his voice muffled by the thick glass. "We have strict orders from the CEO. You are not permitted on the premises tonight." I looked past him and saw my mother watching from the balcony. She didn't wave. She didn't sneer. She simply turned her back on me and walked toward the boardroom, her silver gown trailing behind her like a shroud. She had personally authorized this blockade. She wanted to ensure that by the time I found a way in, the ink would be dry and the Sterling legacy would be sold to our greatest enemy. I didn't waste time arguing with the guard. I didn't scream or demand to speak to my brother. I knew Trey had changed the digital locks, but he had forgotten one very important thing. He saw this building as a piece of real estate, but I saw it as a network of systems. I knew every circuit, every backup line, and every emergency protocol buried in the walls. I turned away from the main doors and walked toward the side of the building near the loading docks. There was a small, inconspicuous metal box tucked behind a concrete pillar. It was the external fire alarm control panel and emergency override station. My father had installed it after a minor electrical fire 10 years ago, and he had given me the master administrative code during a weekend when we were testing the building's resilience. He had told me then that a captain should always be able to get back onto her ship, even if the crew mutinies. I opened the panel, the metal cold against my fingers. I pulled out my phone and connected it to the maintenance port via a specialized cable I kept in my purse. My fintech software immediately recognized the building's operating system. I bypassed the security layer. Trey had installed a clumsy, off-the-shelf firewall that was practically an insult to my skills. "Let's see if you remember the master sequence, Dad," I whispered. I typed in the 64-character alphanumeric code. It wasn't just a password. It was a command that overrode every individual lock in the building for safety inspections. On my screen, a map of the headquarters lit up in green. I initiated a level 1 lockdown override. Suddenly, the silent night was punctuated by a series of heavy mechanical thuds. All over the building, the electromagnetic locks on the doors were disengaging. I heard the main glass doors slide open behind me. I heard the service elevators hum to life. I disconnected my phone, closed the panel, and walked back to the front entrance. The guards were scrambling, looking at their flickering tablets in total confusion. Their access-denied screens had been replaced by a pulsing red emergency maintenance alert. I walked past them, my head held high, the leather binder tucked under my arm. They were too stunned to stop me. I headed straight for the private elevator that led to the executive boardroom. As the doors closed and the lift began its ascent, I checked the live audio feed I had surreptitiously planted earlier. I could hear Trey's voice, strained and high-pitched, speaking to the Vancorp executives. As you can see on page 12, Trey was saying, "The liquidation of the logistics wing will provide an immediate cash infusion of $400 million. My mother and I have already signed the primary transfer. We just need your signature on the final deed of sale, and the Sterling name becomes a subsidiary of Vancorp." "And what about your sister?" a deep, gravelly voice asked. It was Miller, the CEO of Vancorp. "We heard rumors of a legal challenge." "My sister is a non-factor," Trey snapped. "She was left $90 and a reality check. She's currently locked out of the building and likely crying to her therapist. She has no standing and no shares." The elevator dinged. The doors opened to the top floor. The hallway was lined with Vancorp's lawyers, all of them looking smug. I ignored them and walked toward the massive double oak doors of the boardroom. Two more gray-suited guards stepped in my way, but I didn't stop. "Step aside," I said, my voice vibrating with an authority that made them hesitate. "I am the landlord of this building, the owner of the debt you are currently trying to trade, and the only person in this room who actually knows what's behind those doors." Before they could react, I reached for the master control panel next to the door. I swiped my thumb across the biometric scanner. Because of my override, the system didn't check for Trey's approval. It checked for the master admin. The heavy oak doors didn't just open, they swung wide with a violent force slamming against the interior walls. The sound was like a gunshot in the silent room. Trey froze the gold pen hovering just inches above the final signature line. Sasha, who was standing by the window, looking at the city she thought she had conquered, let out a sharp gasp. My mother stood up, her face a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. "Charmaine?" Valerie shrieked. "How dare you interrupt this meeting? Security, get her out of here now!" "The security works for me tonight, Mother," I said, stepping into the room. The Vancorp executives stared at me, their eyes darting between my emerald gown and the heavy binder in my hands. I walked straight to the head of the table and slammed the Apex Trust binder down on top of Trey's contract. The thud echoed through the room, silencing my mother's shouting. "Put the pen down, Trey," I said, my voice low and dangerous. "Because if you sign that paper, you aren't just committing a crime. You're selling a company that I legally seized 2 hours ago." Trey began to laugh, but it was a jagged, hysterical sound. "You're too late. I'm the CEO. I have the title. I have the board's proxy." "You have a title that I've already revoked," I replied. I looked at the Vancorp CEO Miller, who was now looking very uncomfortable. "Mr. Miller, I hope your legal team told you about the shadow debt clause in the Sterling bylaws. Because if they didn't, you're about to buy a $400 million liability that belongs entirely to me." The room went deathly quiet. I opened the binder, revealing the debt acquisition certificates I had secured from the bank. Trey's face went from purple to a ghostly translucent white. He looked at the papers, then at me, and finally at the pen in his hand, as if it were a poisonous snake. "I told you, Trey," I whispered, leaning over the table so only he could hear the finality in my voice. "You can't sell what you don't own, and right now you don't even own the air in your lungs." I turned to the room, my eyes locking onto my mother's horrified expression. The sell-off announcement was over. The takeover had begun. I pulled out my phone and pressed a single button. "Graves, bring them in." The sound of heavy boots began to fill the hallway. Trey looked at the door, then back at me, his lip trembling. He realized finally that the $90 girl hadn't just crashed his party. She had dismantled his entire world, and she was just getting started. The board meeting was officially called to order, and I was the only one with the power to adjourn it. The board meeting was officially called to order, and I was the only one with the power to adjourn it. I didn't hesitate. I marched toward the head of the mahogany table, my heels striking the floor with a rhythmic finality that silenced the room. Trey was hunched over the contract, his hand trembling as he gripped the gold fountain pen. He was seconds away from signing over the soul of Sterling Logistics to Vancorp. My mother Valerie was the first to react. She surged to her feet, her face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated venom. "How dare you!" she shrieked, her voice cracking under the weight of her fury. "Security, get this girl out of here now. I already told the police she is mentally unstable. She is trespassing on a private corporate transition." I didn't even look at her. I walked straight to Trey and slammed the heavy leather binder from the bank down on top of the Vancorp contract. The sound was like a gunshot, making the executives from both sides jump in their seats. I leaned over the table, forcing Trey to meet my eyes. "Put the pen down, Trey," I said, my voice low and dangerously calm. "This meeting is over because this sale is legally impossible." Trey began to laugh, a high-pitched, hysterical sound that echoed off the glass walls. "You are pathetic, Charmaine. You think because you hacked the door locks, you have a seat at this table. I am the CEO. I have the board's proxy. I have the majority signature. You were left $90 because Dad knew you were a loser who would try to sabotage his legacy." I ignored his outburst and turned to Miller, the CEO of Vancorp, who was watching the scene with growing distaste. "Mr. Miller, you are an intelligent man," I said. "I assume your due diligence team mentioned the Apex Shadow Trust. If they didn't, you should fire them immediately." I opened the binder to the primary appointment decree. I am the sole executor of the Apex Trust, which holds the golden shares of the Sterling family empire. These shares carry absolute veto power over any executive asset sale, merger, or liquidation. As the holder of those shares, I am officially vetoing this transaction, The deal is dead. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. Miller leaned forward, squinting at the embossed seal on the documents. He exchanged a frantic look with his lead counsel, who quickly began whispering in his ear. Valerie stepped forward, her eyes darting between the binder and my face. That is a forgery. Charmaine has always been a liar. She's jealous of her brother. It is not a forgery, Valerie Miller said, his voice cold as he stood up. My legal team warned me there was a hidden trust, but Trey assured us he had resolved the oversight. It appears we were lied to. I have no interest in buying a company that comes with a permanent legal injunction and a family war. We are leaving. Miller signaled to his team and they began packing their briefcases with clinical efficiency. Trey's eyes went wide, panic finally replacing his arrogance. No, Miller, wait. This is just a misunderstanding. I can fix this. We had a deal. But the Vancorp team didn't look back. They walked out of the double oak doors without a single word of farewell, leaving the boardroom in a state of absolute ruin. Trey slumped back into his chair, the gold pen slipping from his fingers and rolling across the table. He looked like a man who had just watched his last lifeline snap in half. Sasha, who had been standing silently by the window, suddenly burst into tears, her face buried in her hands. My mother remained standing, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. You've done it now, Valerie hissed, her voice trembling with hatred. You've destroyed the only thing that could have saved this family's reputation. You've humiliated your brother and driven away our investors. Are you happy, Charmaine? Does your petty jealousy feel good now that we are all in the dirt? Trey suddenly let out a jagged, mocking bark of laughter. He straightened his silk tie, his eyes flickering with a desperate, ugly light. You think this is a victory? He sneered, looking up at me. Fine. Keep the dying company, Charmaine. Keep the warehouses and the rusty trucks, and the thousands of employees who are going to hate you when you can't make payroll next week. I don't care. Don't. He stood up, kicking his chair back with a violent thud. I still have the inheritance. You broke little startup girl. I have $200 million in personal assets. I have my mansions. I have my luxury car collection. I have the sterling cash reserves. While you're sitting here playing CEO in an empty building, I'll be sitting on a beach in the south of France, watching you drown in the debt Dad left behind. You got $90, and that is all you will ever have. You're just a broke tech nerd trying to play a queen, but you have no kingdom. I watched him gloat, his chest puffing out with a final pathetic attempt at dominance. He truly believed the millions my father left him were a shield. He truly believed he was still the golden child who had won the prize. He had no idea that the millions were actually the bait, and he had swallowed it whole. I didn't answer him right away. I simply reached into the binder and pulled out the second set of documents, the debt acquisition certificates I had signed earlier. I fanned them out across the table, like a hand of winning cards. Trey glanced at them, his smirk faltering, as he saw the name of his private equity lender on the top sheet. You were right about one thing, Trey, I said, my voice cutting through his bravado. Dad did leave you millions. He left you millions of dollars in predatory debt hidden under the guise of an inheritance. And because you've spent the last week borrowing against that inheritance like a maniac, you've triggered the cross-collateralization clauses. Trey's face went from pale to a sickly, translucent gray. What are you talking about? I tapped the documents. I didn't just veto the sale tonight, Trey. I am here because my company Obsidian Capital just bought your personal debt. I am now your sole creditor. I own the mortgage on your Buckhead mansion. I own the liens on your car collection. And because you attempted to move corporate funds illegally tonight, I have the legal right to freeze every single personal account you think you have. You aren't going to the south of France, Trey. You aren't even going back to your house. Trey's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Sasha stopped crying and looked at him with sheer horror. My mother looked like she had been turned to stone. I looked at the gold pen on the table. You said I was just a broke startup girl, Trey. But the thing about tech nerds is that we know how to follow the money. And I followed yours all the way to the bottom of the ocean. You didn't win millions. You won a prison cell of debt, and I'm the one holding the key. Trey's knees buckled and he fell back into his chair, his hands shaking violently. The reality of his ruin was finally crashing down, and the weight of it was more than he could bear. My mother looked at me, her eyes filled with a sudden sharp realization of her own vulnerability. But I wasn't done with them yet. I looked at the door as the sound of more boots approached the hallway. Trey looked up, his eyes wide with a new kind of terror. He thought the debt was his only problem, but he had forgotten about the $50 million transfer he had tried to force through the system. The financial ruin was just the beginning. The legal consequences were about to walk through the door. I checked my watch. Right on time. The sound of synchronized footsteps echoed from the hallway as Captain Graves and his tactical team took their positions by the oak doors, creating a wall of black Kevlar and cold professionalism. Trey looked at the door, then back at me, his lip trembling with the first real taste of a fear he couldn't talk his way out of. He thought the debt was his only problem. But he had forgotten about the $50 million transfer he had tried to force through the system. The financial ruin was just the beginning. The legal consequences were about to walk through the door. I didn't give him a chance to recover. I walked over to the boardroom projector, the emerald silk of my gown rustling like a warning. I plugged my tablet into the central hub, and the massive 4K screen on the wall flickered to life. "Are you sure about that, Trey?" I asked, my voice cutting through the heavy silence. "You keep talking about your millions and your mansions like they are solid ground. Let's look at the real numbers." I swiped my finger across the tablet and a complex spreadsheet replaced the corporate logo on the screen. It wasn't the sanitized version the estate lawyers had shown them. This was the deep tissue audit of the Sterling family's private holdings. Trey leaned forward, his eyes squinting at the red columns and the fluctuating charts. Sasha moved closer to him, her fingers digging into his shoulder so hard her knuckles turned white. My mother remained standing, her gaze fixed on the screen with a growing sense of dread. "You see, Trey?" I continued, pointing to the top line. Dad was a master of optics. He knew that the only way to protect the core of the business was to create a decoy. He left you and Mother the $200 million estate because he knew you wouldn't look past the number. You saw the gross value of the real estate, the car collection, and the investment portfolios. But look at the bottom line. I zoomed in on a specific cell highlighted in bright, aggressive red. The $200 million inheritance isn't cash. It is the gross asset value of an estate burdened with exactly $210 million in structured debt. Loans, margin calls, and cross-collateralized liabilities that Dad kept separate from the company. Trey's face went from pale to a sickly, translucent gray. "That's impossible," he stammered, his voice cracking. "The lawyer said we were wealthy. The bank gave us everything we asked for." I clicked to the next slide, showing the loan agreements Trey had signed over the last 7 days. "The lawyer showed you the assets, Trey. He didn't show you the liens because Dad had moved the debt into the Apex Trust. You've been spending money that doesn't exist. That $15 million mansion Sasha is bragging about. It was bought with a bridge loan secured by a stock portfolio that has zero net value. The Porsche, the yacht. They are all liabilities." Sasha let out a sharp, piercing scream that echoed off the glass walls. "But the bank approved our loans," she shrieked, her face contorted with a mixture of rage and terror. "We have the money in our accounts. I saw the balance myself. We are the Sterlings. Banks don't just give out millions to people who are broke." I smiled, a slow, cold expression that never reached my eyes. I looked directly at Sasha, then at the man who had tried to evict me from my own life. "The bank approved your loans because the Apex Trust guaranteed them," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. "Every time you swiped that black card, the bank checked with Apex. And because Dad had set the trust to auto-verify for the first week to give you enough rope to hang yourselves, the money flowed." I stepped closer to the table, my shadow stretching across the failed contract Trey was still holding. "And who controls Apex, Sasha?" "I do. I am the sole executor. I am the guarantor of your lifestyle. Which means every dollar you spent on those diamonds, every cent you put down on that house, and every gambling debt Trey paid off in Vegas is now a personal debt owed to me, too." Trey's knees finally gave out, and he collapsed back into the CEO chair, a chair that was no longer his. He looked at his hands as if he expected them to disappear. You, you trapped us, he whispered. No, Trey, I corrected him. Dad trapped you. He knew exactly what you would do the moment his heart stopped beating. He knew you would loot the company and treat the inheritance like a trophy. He gave you the illusion of millions so that I could have the reality of control. You don't have millions, Trey. You have my debt. And as of 60 seconds ago, I've initiated a global freeze on every asset tied to the Apex guarantee. Sasha slumped against the wall, her designer lace dress looking like a tattered costume. My mother finally sat down, her face a mask of absolute defeat. The high society queen of Atlanta was realizing that her crown was made of nothing but unpaid bills. I looked at Trey, who was staring at the screen in a catatonic trance. The broken golden boy had finally run out of light. But the financial ruin was only half the story. I looked toward the door as Captain Graves stepped forward, his hand resting on the holster of his sidearm. The room was silent except for the frantic hum of the server cooling fans. The payoff was finally here. And it was more devastating than any of them could have imagined. I pulled a final document from the binder, the criminal referral for the $50 million illegal transfer. The bank hadn't just blocked the money, they had contacted the authorities. Trey had played right into the final trap. I leaned over the table, the emerald silk of my dress brushing against the contract Trey had been so desperate to sign. Your time is up, Trey. I'm calling in the debt. And I think the people at the door are here to talk to you about your late-night banking habits. The sound of the elevator dabbing signaled the arrival of the federal agents. I stood tall, the $90 girl who had outplayed the billion-dollar heirs without breaking a sweat. It was time for the final act, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. Trey looked at the door, his eyes wide with a new kind of terror, realizing that his sister wasn't just his creditor, she was his judge. I checked my tablet one last time. The transfer to my company's account was complete. I was no longer a startup, I was the Sterling legacy. I was no longer a startup. I was the Sterling legacy. The air in the boardroom was thick with the scent of ozone from the projector and the metallic tang of Trey's mounting terror. I walked around the long mahogany table, my emerald train sweeping over the very spot where the Vancorp contract lay rejected and useless. Trey was still slumped in the CEO chair, his hands flat on the table, staring at the digital audit on the screen as if he could make the red numbers disappear by sheer force of will. I leaned down, resting my hands on the table right in front of him. You thought $90 was a joke, Trey, but that $90 was the price of your freedom, and you threw it away the second you tried to sell what didn't belong to you. Dad knew exactly who you were. He knew you were a parasite who would drain the life out of this family the moment he wasn't there to stop you. He didn't leave you millions to reward you. He gave you just enough rope to hang yourself, and you tied the knot perfectly. Trey looked up, his eyes bloodshot and unfocused. This is a setup, he croaked. You manipulated the accounts. You're the one who stole. I straightened up, a cold laugh escaping my lips. I didn't have to steal a cent, Trey. While you were busy playing king in a cardboard crown, I was working. I saw the debt collectors circling you like vultures. I saw your bookies in Vegas getting impatient. So I did what any good sister would do. I helped them out. My company, Obsidian Capital, bought every single one of your personal debts. The gambling markers, the margin loans, the high-interest bridge loans for that Buckhead mansion. I am your sole creditor now. If you had run the company honestly, if you had shown even a shred of the integrity Dad spent 50 years building, you could have paid that debt off over time. Instead, you tried to embezzle $50 million from the corporate reserve to cover your tracks. You didn't just fail, Trey. You committed a felony to hide the fact that you're broke. Sasha let out a strangled sob from the corner of the room, her designer lace dress looking like a tattered costume. She looked at Trey with a mixture of disgust and horror, finally realizing that the man she had hitched her star to was nothing but a sinking ship. Valerie, who had been silent for the last 10 minutes, suddenly moved. The ice-cold matriarch was gone, replaced by a woman whose pride had been shattered into a million jagged pieces. She stepped toward me, her hands reaching out in a gesture that was half plead, half command. Zuri, baby, please, she said, her voice trembling, stripped of its usual velvet authority. We are blood. We are the Sterlings. You can't do this to your own family. Think of the scandal. Think of what people will say at the club. We can fix this. I'll make Trey apologize. We'll bring you into the board. Just tell the bank to release the hold. You can't do this to your own mother." I looked at her, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel the need for her approval. I didn't feel the sting of her constant criticism or the weight of her impossible expectations. I felt nothing but a calm professional detachment. I reached into my purse and pulled out the small wrinkled receipt for the $90 I had received in the lawyer's office. I slid it across the polished wood, letting it stop right in front of her manicured hand. "You told me to sign and leave, Mother," I said, my voice as steady as a heartbeat. "You told me I wasn't family enough for a seat at the table. You told me to take my $90 and disappear so Trey could have his glory. Well, now it's your turn." Valerie looked down at the receipt as if it were a poisonous spider. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that as of 10 o'clock tonight, I have initiated foreclosure proceedings on the Buckhead mansion," I replied. "Since the mortgage is held by my subsidiary and the interest has been in default for 72 hours, I am exercising the immediate possession clause. You and Trey have exactly 12 hours to vacate the premises. Pack your clothes, Mother. Leave the jewelry and the art they were bought with sterling corporate funds that are currently under audit for embezzlement. You wanted me out of your sight, you got your wish." The room went deathly silent. Sasha began to wail a high-pitched rhythmic sound of pure despair. Valerie sank into a chair, her face a mask of gray, withered shock. The Queen of Atlanta had just been evicted by the daughter she tried to bury. Trey, however, didn't sink into despair. He snapped. The pressure of the last hour, the loss of his fortune, and the looming threat of prison finally broke the last tether to his sanity. He let out a primal, guttural roar and lunged across the table toward me. His face was a contorted mask of rage, his fingers clawing at the air like talons. "I'm going to kill you!" he screamed. "You ruined everything. You're nothing. You're nothing." I didn't move. I didn't have to. Before Trey's hands could even get close to my throat, two shadows blurred across my vision. Captain Graves and his lead sergeant, the very same elite corporate security guards Trey had used to mockingly evict me from my office in Section 3, moved with a lethal mechanical efficiency. Graves caught Trey mid-air, his massive hand clamping onto Trey's shoulder and spinning him around. The sergeant grabbed Trey's other arm, forcing it behind his back with a sharp, sickening pop of a joint. Trey's face hit the mahogany table with a heavy thud. He struggled, his legs kicking out, but the guards held him down like he was an unruly child. "Get him out of my sight," I said, my voice ringing with a finality that made even the Vancorp lawyers in the hallway shiver. Graves and his sergeant didn't hesitate. They hauled Trey to his feet, his silk tie tattered and his expensive suit jacket bunched up around his neck. They began to drag him toward the double oak doors, his heels squealing against the floor as he fought against their grip. "You think you've won?" Trey shrieked, his voice echoing down the hallway as they dragged him toward the service elevators. "I'll come back for you. I'll burn this whole building down with you in it. You're dead, Charmaine. You hear me? Dead." The elevator doors dived, taking his screams with them. I stood in the center of the silent boardroom, the only person left standing. Sasha was curled in a ball on the floor, and my mother was staring at the $90 receipt, as if it were a mirror showing her the truth of her life. I looked at the gold pen Trey had dropped. I picked it up, walked to the head of the table, and signed the executive order to dissolve Trey's CEO status and appoint myself as the interim chairwoman of Sterling Logistics. The ink was dark and permanent. I turned to Captain Graves, who had returned to the room, his expression completely unreadable. "Sir, please escort Mrs. Sterling and her daughter-in-law to the lobby. Arrange for a car to take them to the mansion so they can begin packing. They have until 10 a.m. tomorrow. If they are still there at 10:01, call the sheriff." "Understood," Miss Sterling, Graves replied with a crisp, respectful nod. I walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over the lights of Atlanta. The city looked the same, but the power dynamic had shifted forever. My father hadn't left me $90 as a test. He had left it as a weapon, knowing I was the only one who would know how to aim it. I felt a deep, resonant sense of peace. The black sheep had returned and she had brought the shears. I pulled out my phone and dialed Marcus. "Marcus, it's done," I said. "Bring the team back in. We have a lot of work to do and I want to be ready for the opening bell. We're not a startup anymore. We're the ones in charge." I hung up and watched the sun beginning to peek over the horizon. The House of Sterling had fallen, but from the rubble, I was going to build something that actually deserved the name. I took a deep breath, the air in the room finally feeling clean. The audit was over, the debt was settled, and for the first time in 35 years, I was exactly where I belonged. I turned away from the window and headed toward my new office. There was a legacy to rebuild, and I wasn't going to waste another second. My name is Charmaine, and I am the only Sterling that matters now. 6 months have passed since that explosive night in the boardroom. The dust has finally settled, and the landscape of the Sterling Empire is unrecognizable to those who knew it under my brother's brief, disastrous reign. I am sitting in my father's old high-backed leather chair on the penthouse floor, the same chair Trey tried to claim as his throne. The view of the Atlanta skyline is breathtaking, a grid of lights that represents the pulse of a city I now move with a single keystroke. I didn't just save Sterling Logistics, I revolutionized it. By merging my fintech startup's proprietary tracking and automated payment algorithms with our global shipping network, I eliminated the middleman and slashed our overhead by 40%. Investors who once fled under my mother's pressure are now begging for a seat at the table. The company's value hasn't just recovered, it has tripled. I am no longer the black sheep or the rebellious daughter. I am the architect of the most successful corporate turnaround in the city's history. Sometimes I take a moment to look at the small framed photo of my father on the corner of this massive desk. I think he'd be proud not just of the profit margins, but of the way I protected the families who depend on our payroll. I realized that my father didn't give me that $90 to be cruel. He gave it to me because he knew that true power isn't handed down in a will. It is built in the dark through resilience and a refusal to be defined by someone else's low expectations. Of course, the fall of the House of Sterling was just as public as its rise. I recently received a report from the private investigator I hired to keep a distant eye on the aftermath. It was a satisfying, if sobering, read. Sasha didn't stay long once the credit cards were declined, and the Buckhead mansion was boarded up. She filed for divorce before Trey's first court hearing, claiming she was a victim of his financial deception. These days, she's shifted her brand from luxury lifestyle to wellness influencer. I saw a clip of her last week on Instagram Live, the same platform she used to mock me. She was standing in a poorly lit kitchen trying to sell detox tea and overpriced leggings to a dwindling audience. The diamonds are gone, replaced by cheap costume jewelry that leaves green marks on her skin. She is still desperate for attention, but now the world is mostly laughing at her. As for Trey and my mother, their reality is much smaller. After the legal fees drained what little liquid assets they had managed to hide, they moved into a cramped two-bedroom apartment far outside the city limits. It's a place Valerie would have called a slum 6 months ago. The investigator says the neighbors constantly complain about the noise. They spend their days trapped in a cycle of bitterness, arguing endlessly about whose fault the collapse was. Valerie blames Trey for his gambling and his arrogance. Trey blames Valerie for enabling him and for underestimating me. They are living in a prison of their own making, fueled by a legacy they destroyed with their own hands. They are still Sterlings by name, but they are strangers to the world they once tried to rule. I stood up from the desk and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window. The sun was setting, casting long golden shadows over the city. I thought about the girl who was once told to find another table because she wasn't family. I thought about the woman who was offered $90 as an insult. They thought that $90 inheritance was a joke. They laughed because they saw the price of the paper, but they didn't realize it was the key to the kingdom. They were so busy looking down at me that they never saw the ground disappearing beneath their own feet. I didn't have to raise my voice to defeat them. I just had to be better than they ever believed I could be. Has anyone in your family ever underestimated your worth only to watch you become the person who eventually signs their paychecks? Have you ever had to sit in silence while they dug their own graves knowing you held the shovel? I would love to hear your stories of resilience and your own moments of ultimate payoff in the comments below. If this journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories about finding your power when the world tries to take it away. Your worth is never determined by those who fail to see it. It's determined by what you do when the odds are against you. Remember, sometimes the greatest weapon you have is the silence you maintain while your enemies convince themselves they've already won. Thank you for joining me on this journey. My name is Charmaine, and this is just the beginning of my new legacy. Good night, Atlanta. The story of Charmaine teaches us that true power is not inherited through titles or handed over by blood, but built through resilience, competence, and foresight. While her family focused on the superficial prestige of a billion-dollar name, Charmaine invested in her own skills and gathered the digital receipts of their failures. It serves as a powerful reminder that being underestimated is often a hidden advantage. It allows you to move in silence and build an unshakable foundation, while those who underestimate you dig their own graves with arrogance and greed. If you've ever turned being the black sheep into your greatest strength, hit the like button and share your success story in the comments below.